Tonight we pull back the velvet curtain on a world most of us only dream of. The annual Metropolitan Legacy Gala, a glittering affair on Fifth Avenue, where old money and new power collide. For corporate raider Jack Davenport, it was supposed to be a victory lap, a public debut with his beautiful young mistress on his arm, a final unspoken insult to the wife he'd cast aside. He believed he had written her ending. What he never anticipated was that his ex-wife Isabella wouldn't just show up. She would arrive with a man whose power could swallow his whole, ready to author a brilliant new chapter of her own. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's the story of what happens when a man's greatest asset was the woman he failed to value. Stay with us as we watch a carefully constructed empire of ego begin to crumble in a single night. The air inside the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Great Hall was thick with the scent of money power and blossoming white orchids that climbed the colossal Roman columns like ghostly vines. It was the scent of victory to Jack Davenport. He adjusted the crisp black lapels of his Tom Ford tuxedo, his cufflink a shard of a meteorite encased in platinum, catching the light from the chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations overhead. On his arm, Chloe Jennings was a vision in crimson. The dress was daring a slash of silk that clung to her yoga-toned body and plunged precariously low. She was 24, an age that felt like a statement in itself. Her laughter was a little too loud, her grip on his arm a little too tight, but Jack didn't mind. She was a beautiful, breathing testament to his continued dominance. She was his upgrade. "Darling, is that Beatrice Worthington over there?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with a social climber's hunger. Her family practically owns half of the Upper East Side. They own a respectable portfolio of pre-war real estate, Chloe. "Let's not exaggerate," Jack corrected smoothly, his tone laced with the casual condescension he reserved for those he considered beneath him. He guided her through the throng, nodding curtly at familiar faces, bankers, tech moguls, and political figures. Each nod was a transaction, a reassertion of his place in this gilded ecosystem. He was Jack Davenport, the shark of Wall Street, the man who had built Davenport Capital from a boutique firm into a predatory behemoth. His divorce from Isabella had been finalized 6 months ago. It was in his mind a necessary shedding of dead weight. Isabella had been the perfect wife for the man he was, the quiet, supportive, intelligent partner who hosted flawless dinner parties and remembered the names of his clients' children. She was classic, elegant, and utterly predictable. But he was no longer that man. He was a titan now, and titans required more. More youth, more vivacity, more flash. Chloe was flash personified. "Mr. Davenport, a pleasure," a portly man with a flushed face. Philip Carter of Carter Industries greeted him, his eyes flicking appreciatively over Chloe. "Philip," Jack acknowledged, a tight smile on his lips. He enjoyed the envy in other men's eyes. It was a currency as valuable as any stock. They made their way toward the main ballroom, the orchestra swelling to a crescendo. Jack felt a surge of profound satisfaction. Everything was perfect. He had the power, the reputation, and the woman. The past was a closed chapter, a footnote in his epic biography. Isabella was probably at home in her tastefully beige apartment, cataloguing her art books, or whatever it was she did with her time now. He almost felt a pang of pity for her. Almost. It was Chloe who saw her first. Her grip on his arm suddenly became a vice. "Jack," she hissed, her voice losing its practiced sweetness. "Don't look now, but is that—" Jack's gaze followed hers, sweeping across the sea of tuxedos and couture gowns. He scanned the crowd, his eyes passing over her once, twice, before they snagged and held. And in that moment, the perfectly chilled champagne in his stomach turned to acid. It was Isabella, but it wasn't the Isabella he remembered. The woman standing near the grand staircase was not the muted, elegant shadow he had left behind. This woman was a supernova. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet, a creation so exquisitely tailored it looked as if it had been woven from starlight and shadow. It was demure by Chloe's standards, with long sleeves and a high neckline, but it clung to her figure in a way that was more sensuous than any display of skin. Diamonds glittered at her ears and throat, not ostentatiously, but with the quiet, confident fire of old, important stones. Her dark hair, which she used to wear in a simple, elegant chignon, was styled in soft, cascading waves that framed a face that was luminous. She wasn't just beautiful, she radiated a serenity and confidence that was entirely new. It was a power that had nothing to do with him. And then he saw the man whose hand rested possessively, yet gently, on the small of her back. He didn't recognize him at first. The man was tall and lean, with a quiet intensity that seemed to draw the room's energy towards him rather than projecting out into it. He wore a simple, impeccably cut tuxedo, no flashy accessories, no boisterous greetings. He was speaking softly to Isabella, his head inclined towards hers, a small, genuine smile on his face as she laughed. It was a laugh Jack hadn't heard in years, light, unburdened, and real. "Who is that?" With her, Jack demanded, his voice a low growl. Chloe, who devoured gossip columns like breakfast, knew instantly. "Oh my God." She breathed a strange mix of awe and terror in her voice. "Jack, that's Adrien Dubois." The name landed in the opulent room like a detonation. Adrien Dubois, the reclusive tech billionaire, the man who had revolutionized data security with his company Aegis Dynamics. He was new money, but the kind of new money that made old money nervous. He was notoriously private, rarely photographed, and almost never attended events like this. He was a ghost, a legend, and he was standing there looking at Jack's ex-wife as if she were the only person in a room of 1,000. Jack felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. This was not supposed to happen. Isabella was supposed to fade away. She was not supposed to reappear on the arm of a man who could buy and sell him 10 times over, looking like she had just been reborn from his ashes. The narrative he had so carefully crafted for the evening, his triumphant debut, was already beginning to unravel. To understand Jack's shock, you had to understand the cage he had built for Isabella. A cage so beautifully decorated she hadn't realized its bars were made of steel. Their marriage had begun as a partnership. She was an art history graduate with a brilliant eye. He was a hungry young analyst at a brokerage firm. He had the ambition, she had the grace. Isabella smoothed his rough edges, taught him which fork to use, curated his wardrobe, and transformed their modest apartment into a salon where his superiors felt at ease. She was his secret weapon, the architect of his social ascent. "You have impeccable taste, Izzy," he'd tell her after a successful dinner party. "They loved you. Philip Carter's wife is still raving about your knowledge of 17th century Dutch art." She would smile, pleased with her contribution. She believed they were a team. Davenport and Rossi. It had a nice ring to it. But somewhere along the line, as his star ascended, the and Rossi was silently erased. He became Jack Davenport, and she became Mrs. Davenport, an elegant accessory to his greatness. The end began not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet dismissals. "Izzy, I'm bringing home the board of a company I'm acquiring. Can you handle it?" He'd ask, not waiting for an answer. He stopped seeing her work, the hours of planning the calls to caterers, the selection of wine, the careful seating chart designed to maximize his influence as a contribution. He saw it as a function of her role as natural and expected as the sun rising. One evening, about a year before the divorce, she had been excited. The Moreau Institute, a prestigious art foundation, had offered her a position on their acquisitions committee. It was a dream come true, a chance to use her expertise in a professional capacity. She waited until he was in a good mood after he'd closed a particularly vicious hostile takeover. She presented the offer letter to him over a glass of his favorite Macallan 20. He scanned the letter, his brow furrowed. "It's an unpaid position. It's a board position, Jack. They're rarely paid. It's for the prestige, the influence, for the love of it. He handed the letter back to her, his expression unreadable. And when would you find the time? You have the gala for the Children's Fund to plan next month, and I need you to host the Japanese delegation in 2 weeks. I can do both, she insisted. I'm organized, you know that. He sighed, the sound heavy with manufactured patience. Isabella, my dear, your job is here, with me, supporting me. That's a full-time commitment. Your hobbies are lovely, but my career is what pays for this penthouse, for your clothes, for the life we have. Let's not lose focus on what's important. The word hobbies struck her like a physical blow. Her passion, her expertise, her dream reduced to a hobby. It was the moment she realized she wasn't his partner anymore. She was an employee in a gilded cage, and her compensation was the lifestyle he provided. The final straw was Chloe Jennings. She wasn't the first Isabella suspected, but she was the most blatant. Jack started coming home late, smelling of a different perfume, a youthful, cloying scent that was nothing like her classic Chanel number 8. He became careless, leaving receipts from lavish dinners for two on his dresser, text messages, lighting up his phone screen with heart emojis. She confronted him one rainy Tuesday morning. He was knotting his tie, his reflection cold and distant in the antique mirror they'd bought together in Italy. "Who is she, Jack?" Isabella asked, her voice shaking only slightly. She had practiced being calm. He didn't feign ignorance. He was beyond that. "Her name is Chloe. It's not serious." "Not serious." Isabella felt a hollow laugh bubble in her chest. "You're taking her to restaurants we used to go to. You bought her a Cartier bracelet, the same one you bought me for our 5th anniversary. He turned to face her, and there was no remorse in his eyes, only irritation. "Isabella, let's be realistic. We've grown apart. I have certain needs. You and I were comfortable. It's a good arrangement." "An arrangement." She echoed the words, tasting like poison. "I thought it was a marriage." "It is what it is," he said, shrugging into his jacket. "Look, I have a 9 o'clock. Let's not be dramatic. Nothing has to change." But everything had changed. He saw her not as a woman he had wronged, but as an obstacle to his convenience. That night, she didn't cry. She called her lawyer. The divorce was swift and surgically precise. Jack, expecting a messy, emotional battle, was surprised by her composure. She didn't fight for the penthouse on Park Avenue or the house in the Hamptons. He offered her a generous settlement, one he considered a golden parachute to silence her. She accepted the baseline amount stipulated in their prenup, a document he'd insisted on, which now felt like a blessing to her. She didn't want his guilt money. "All I want," she told her lawyer, "are my personal effects, my books, and the art I personally acquired for our collection. Specifically, the Rothko study." Jack had laughed when his lawyer relayed this. The Rothko study was a small, unassuming piece he'd always considered drab. He gladly let her have it. He didn't understand that to her the painting wasn't about monetary value. It was about owning something whose worth he could never comprehend. It was the first piece of her life she was taking back. The day she moved out, he was on a business trip in Hong Kong. She walked through the silent, cavernous apartment, her footsteps echoing in the life they had built. She looked at the expensive furniture, the panoramic city, views the curated objects of a perfect life. And she felt nothing but relief. She wasn't losing a husband. She was escaping a warden. The world expected her to collapse to become a tragic society divorcee. Instead, she disappeared. She took the settlement money, sold the Rothko study to a private collector for a small fortune. Its value had quadrupled, a fact Jack was blissfully unaware of, and she began to build. She didn't build a new social life. She built a new self. She reconnected with her contacts in the art world, not as Mrs. Davenport, but as Isabella Rossi. And the world of art, which values authenticity and vision, welcomed her back with open arms. It was at an art auction in Geneva that she met Adrien Dubois. He wasn't there for the glittering spectacle. He was there bidding anonymously through a proxy for a rare sculpture by Giacometti. She was there advising a client. They ended up in a bidding war. She won. Afterward, he found her in the gallery. He didn't introduce himself as a billionaire. He just said, "You have a better eye than my advisor. You saw the flaw in the provenance that I missed." They talked for hours about art, about passion, about the difference between price and value. He didn't care about her past or who she had been married to. He was fascinated by who she was, her mind, her insight, her quiet strength. Their relationship grew, not in the glare of paparazzi flashes, but in the quiet of museums, private galleries, and late-night conversations. He didn't try to possess her. He celebrated her. He didn't see her as an accessory. He saw her as his equal. So when Isabella stood on that staircase at the Met, it wasn't an act of revenge. It was a declaration of existence. She was no longer a ghost in Jack Davenport's story. She was the hero of her own. And Jack, watching from across the room, was just beginning to understand what a terrible mistake he had made in underestimating the woman he thought he knew. The moment Isabella and Adrian began their descent down the grand staircase was the moment the gravitational center of the gala shifted. A hush fell over the immediate area, a subtle dip in the cacophony of chatter as heads turned not with the brash curiosity reserved for celebrities, but with the respectful intrigue reserved for true power. Isabella moved with a newfound grace. It wasn't just the dress or the diamonds. It was an internal poise that radiated outward. Every step was deliberate, serene. She wasn't scanning the room for approval or recognition. Her focus was on Adrian, her expression a mixture of affection and amusement as he whispered something in her ear. Jack watched, frozen in place. He felt Chloe's nails dig into his forearm. "Everyone is staring," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. But they weren't staring at Chloe's daring crimson dress anymore. They were staring at Isabella's quiet majesty. The couple at the bottom of the stairs, Beatrice Worthington, the queen bee of Manhattan society, and her husband, gave a clear signal to the rest of the room. Beatrice, a woman whose smile could make or break a social season, beamed at Isabella, air-kissing her on both cheeks with genuine warmth. "Isabella, my dear, you look absolutely breathtaking. That gown is a masterpiece," Beatrice declared, her voice carrying. "And Adrian keeping you hidden from us all. How cruel." "Beatrice, you know I prefer the quiet life," Adrian replied, his voice a calm, deep baritone that contrasted sharply with Jack's clipped, aggressive speech. His smile was genuine. But Isabella insisted the gala's cause was too important to miss. Isabella added smoothly, "Adrian was generous enough to secure the new Degas sculpture for the contemporary wing auction tonight. We felt we should at least see it off." A wave of murmurs rippled through the onlookers. The Degas sculpture was the crown jewel of the night's charity auction, a piece so rare its acquisition had been the talk of the art world for months. The benefactor had been anonymous, until now. Jack felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. He had donated a paltry $50,000 to the gala, an amount calculated for maximum public relations credit with minimum financial impact. Adrien Dubois had donated a multi-million-dollar masterpiece and hadn't even sought credit for it until this very moment. It was a power play so subtle and so potent, it made Jack's own posturing look childish. "He what, Chloe?" breathed, her mind racing. "Jack, that's... I know what it is." Jack snapped, his composure cracking. He needed to regain control of the narrative. He straightened his tie, pasted on a predatory smile, and began to steer Chloe towards them. It was a move born of pure distilled arrogance. He would face this head-on, reduce Isabella back to his ex-wife, a woman with a lucky new benefactor. As they approached, Adrian's gaze met Jack's over Isabella's head. There was no malice in his eyes, no overt challenge. There was something far more unnerving, utter indifference. It was the look a lion might give a buzzing fly. Isabella turned as they drew near, her serene expression solidifying into a mask of cool neutrality. Her eyes, which once held love, then pain, now held nothing for him at all. It was this emptiness that struck him more than any look of hatred could. Well, well, Jack began, his voice booming slightly. Too loud. Isabella, it's been a while. You're looking, well. He let his gaze sweep over her, intending for it to be possessive, a reminder of their shared history. It came off as leering. Jack, she said, her voice even and cool. The single word was a dismissal. She didn't offer a handshake, nor did she acknowledge Chloe, who was fidgeting beside him like a nervous understudy. Adrian, however, turned his head slightly to look at Chloe, then back at Jack. He didn't offer a hand either. Davenport, he said, his tone as flat and hard as granite. He knew exactly who Jack was. The social circle around them had gone quiet, watching the unfolding drama with barely concealed glee. This was better than the orchestra, more riveting than the art. Jack, desperate to assert his relevance, gestured dismissively at Adrian. I see you've been keeping busy. I didn't take you for the tech type, Izzy. The use of the old pet name was a deliberate barb, an attempt to drag her back into the box he had made for her. Before Isabella could respond, Adrian answered for her, his hand never leaving her back. Isabella has an appreciation for anything brilliantly designed, he said, his eyes fixed on Jack. Whether it's a 17th century painting or a quantum encryption algorithm, it's a quality that requires a certain depth of perception. The insult was so sharp, so elegantly delivered, that it took a moment for its full impact to land. He was calling Jack a shallow fool in front of the most influential people in New York City. Chloe, feeling the crushing weight of the moment, decided to intervene. It was a catastrophic mistake. She thrust her hand forward towards Isabella, her smile brittle. I'm Chloe Jennings. It's so lovely to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you. Isabella's gaze drifted down to the offered hand and then back up to Chloe's face. She didn't take it. After a beat of excruciating silence, she simply said, I'm sure you have. The rejection was absolute. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, cold, and utterly devastating. In that moment, Chloe was defined not as Jack's new partner, but as the woman Isabella Rossi refused to acknowledge. Jack's face, which had been a mask of strained joviality, began to mottle with red. He had come here tonight to be the king of the ball. Instead, he was being publicly cast as a court jester in a drama where he wasn't even the main character. He saw it in the eyes of the people watching, the pity from some, the schadenfreude from others. Philip Carter, who had been so admiring just 30 minutes earlier, was now watching with a fascinated, predatory smirk. Isabella gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Beatrice Worthington, a silent cue that the conversation was over. Beatrice, you must tell me what you think of the placement for the Degas. Adrian and I were just about to inspect it. With that, she and Adrian turned and walked away, the crowd parting for them as if they were royalty. They didn't look back. Jack and Chloe were left in their wake, standing in a circle of silence that felt like a spotlight. Chloe's face was pale, her bravado shattered. Jack's hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He had never felt so utterly publicly neutered in his entire life. The night was still young, but his defeat was already total. Or so he thought. The real humiliation had yet to even begin. The encounter acted like a lit match on dry tinder. Within minutes, the whispers had caught fire and were spreading through the great hall like an unstoppable blaze. The story was repeated, embellished, and analyzed from every angle. Did you see the way she looked right through him? And the dress, a custom piece by that reclusive Belgian designer, I hear. Utterly chic. Adrien Dubois, I haven't seen him at a public event in 5 years, and he looks at her like she hung the moon. Poor Jack Davenport. He thought he was debuting a starlet, and he ended up being the opening act for a queen. Jack could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The backs that were once slapped were now turned. The greetings that were once warm were now cool and brief. He was no longer the shark. He was the chum. He tried to laugh it off, grabbing a flute of champagne from a passing waiter and downing it in 2 swallows. "Can you believe the nerve?" he muttered to Chloe, who was trying desperately to look unfazed. "Parading around with him. It's pathetic." A clear cry for attention. "She wouldn't even shake my hand," Chloe said, her voice trembling slightly. "In front of everyone. Forget about her," Jack said, his jaw tight. "She's nobody, a forgotten relic. This is our night." But his words rang hollow even to himself. He watched Isabella and Adrian from across the room. They weren't grandstanding or working the crowd. They were engaged in quiet conversations, drawing people to them. He saw Isabella speaking with the director of the museum, her hands moving with graceful emphasis as she made a point about the lighting in the Impressionist gallery. He saw Adrian in a deep discussion with the Secretary of the Treasury, not about finance, but about a philanthropic initiative for digital literacy in underserved communities. They weren't just attending the gala, they were a part of its fabric, woven into the very tapestry of power in the room, while he and Chloe were merely gaudy threads, suddenly looking cheap and out of place. The evening wore on a slow-motion torture for Jack. During dinner, he was seated at a table far from the central dais, a clear social demotion. His table mates were minor players, sycophants, who still orbited him, but their flattery now seemed desperate and pathetic. From his seat, he had a clear view of the head table where Isabella sat between Adrian and the mayor of New York. She would laugh, her face illuminated by the candlelight, and it felt like a personal affront. Desperate to reassert himself, Jack made a tactical error. During a lull in the conversation at his table, he saw an old acquaintance, a journalist named Michael Spencer, who wrote a powerful financial column for the Wall Street Journal, passing by. "Michael, get over here, you old dog." Jack called out, his voice a little too loud from the champagne. Spencer approached hesitantly, his journalist's senses clearly tingling. "Jack, having a good evening, fantastic," Jack lied. "Thinking of my next big move. Davenport Capital is leaner and meaner than ever since I streamlined my personal life." He winked, a clumsy gesture meant to frame his divorce as a strategic business decision. Spencer's eyes flickered over to Isabella's table. "Is that right? Seems like Mrs. Rosie Dubois is doing some streamlining of her own." The hyphenated name hit Jack like a body blow. Rosie Dubois. He hadn't even known. He had assumed. He didn't know what he'd assumed. He hadn't bothered to find out. "Rossi." Jack corrected, his voice sharp. "Her name is Isabella Rossi." Spencer raised an eyebrow. "Not according to the gala's benefactor list. It's listed as a joint donation from Mr. Adrien Dubois and Mrs. Isabella Rossi Dubois. A very generous one at that. They're co-chairing the museum's new technology and arts program. Co-chairing, a joint donation, a new name. These were not the actions of a woman having a fling. These were the actions of a woman building an empire with a new king on the ashes of her old life. Every new detail was another shovel of dirt on the grave of Jack's ego. "She's a clever one," Jack said, trying to sound admiring but coming across as bitter. "Always knew how to land on her feet." The implication was clear. She was a gold digger who had traded up. Spencer wasn't buying it. "I don't know, Jack," he said, his voice taking on a professional, analytical tone. "I ran into her at Art Basel a few months ago. She was negotiating the sale of a private collection to the Getty. Drove a hard bargain. The art world takes her very seriously. She's not just someone's wife anymore. She's a major player in her own right." Spencer excused himself, leaving Jack stewing in a fresh wave of humiliation. He had always believed he was the substance and she was the style. The idea that she possessed a formidable intellect and business acumen that was now flourishing without him was incomprehensible. It fundamentally challenged his entire self-concept. He had not just lost a wife, he had lost an asset whose value he had criminally underestimated. The poison of the whispers was now coursing through his veins. He looked at Chloe, who was pushing a piece of sea bass around her plate, her crimson dress suddenly looking garish under the elegant lighting. He had chosen her for her looks, for her youth. But in this arena, against this level of sophisticated power, she was a liability. She had no depth, no conversation beyond gossip and brands. She was a beautiful, hollow thing. And standing next to the memory of Isabella, and the stunning reality of her now Chloe seemed to fade into insignificance. And the most terrifying part for Jack was the realization that perhaps he was fading right along with her. Feeling invisible is a special kind of hell for a woman like Chloe Jennings. Her entire life had been a campaign for visibility. She had worked tirelessly at the gym, in tanning beds, at the hairdressers, to become the kind of woman a man like Jack Davenport would notice. And she had succeeded. She had won the prize. But tonight, the prize felt like a consolation trophy. The admiring glances she was used to were now directed elsewhere. The whispers were not about her beauty, but about her public snubbing. She was no longer the star. She was a footnote in Isabella Rossi Dubois's triumphant return. The bitterness was a hard, indigestible lump in her throat. During a break before the charity auction, she saw Isabella slip away from her table and head in the direction of the restrooms. Fueled by champagne and a desperate need to reclaim some semblance of status, Chloe decided to act. She excused herself, leaving Jack to his brooding, and followed. The powder room was an oasis of marble and rose-gold fixtures, momentarily empty, save for the two of them. Isabella was standing at the mirror, not reapplying makeup, but simply taking a quiet moment, her reflection showing a woman perfectly at ease in her own skin. Chloe entered the click of her heels, unnaturally loud on the marble floor. She took the sink next to Isabella's, pulling her lipstick from her clutch with a flourish. "It's a beautiful party, isn't it?" Chloe began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Isabella met her eyes in the mirror. "It's a very important fundraiser, yes." Her tone was polite but coolly distant. She made no move to leave a silent challenge for Chloe to state her purpose. Jack was so looking forward to it. Chloe continued, applying a fresh coat of crimson to her lips. A chance to finally relax. You know, it's been a stressful year for him. The divorce was so hard on him. It was a pathetic, transparent gambit, an attempt to paint Isabella as the cruel woman who had wounded the great man. Isabella finally turned from the mirror to face Chloe directly. Her gaze was not angry or hurt. It was analytical, like a scientist observing a specimen. "I imagine liquidating a 20-year partnership for a newer, shinier model does come with a certain amount of paperwork," Isabella said, her voice soft but laced with ice. Chloe's practiced smile faltered. This wasn't the tearful, scorned ex-wife she had imagined. "That's not fair. He really loved you. He still talks about you. Does he?" Isabella asked, a single eyebrow arching in faint amusement. "Does he talk about the nights I spent editing his business proposals until 3 a.m.? Or the time I diagnosed the flaw in his acquisition strategy for that pharmaceutical company, a flaw that would have cost him his entire reputation? Or does he just talk about the dinner parties?" Chloe was stunned into silence. She had no idea about any of that. The Isabella in Jack's stories was a domestic creature, a manager of households, not a strategic partner. I think Isabella continued, her voice dropping to a confidential, almost pitying tone, "that you and I have been told two very different stories about the same man. Your story is, I'm sure, very romantic. Mine is a cautionary tale." She took a step closer, and Chloe instinctively took a step back. Isabella wasn't threatening, but the sheer force of her presence was overwhelming. "Let me give you some advice, woman to woman," Isabella said, her voice now devoid of all emotion. "Men like Jack don't have partners. They have assets. And assets are managed, polished, displayed, and eventually they are liquidated when they no longer serve their primary function. Right now, your function is to make him feel young and powerful. But youth fades, and his kind of power is precarious. What will your function be then? Chloe stared at her, speechless. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing her fantasy. You think you won something from me? Isabella concluded, turning back to the mirror and picking up her small, elegant clutch. But you can't win a prize the other person has already willingly discarded. I wasn't defeated. I was liberated. She gave Chloe one last look in the mirror, a look that was not unkind, but was filled with a profound, soul-crushing pity. He will do to you what he did to me. The only difference is, I had a life to go back to. Make sure you build one for yourself before your asset value depreciates. With that, Isabella swept out of the powder room, leaving Chloe standing alone in the marble silence. The crimson lipstick suddenly looked like a wound on her pale face. For the first time, she saw the fine print on the contract of her glamorous new life. She had thought she was the victor, the one who had taken the king. Isabella had just revealed to her that all she had really done was volunteer to be the next captive in the tower, and she had handed the key to her own cage to the jailer herself. The triumph she felt had curdled into terror. The main event of the evening was the live auction. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation, the earlier drama adding a spicy undercurrent to the philanthropy. The auctioneer, a man with a silver tongue and a knack for prying open the wallets of the wealthy, was in top form. Bidding was fierce for lavish holidays, rare wines, and bespoke jewelry. Jack, however, was simmering in a toxic brew of champagne and wounded pride. The encounter in the powder room had left Chloe shaken and silent, her presence now a constant reminder of his miscalculation. He needed to do something. He needed a grand gesture to reclaim his status, to remind this room of who he was. The final item was announced. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the crown jewel of our evening, a recently discovered preparatory sculpture by Edgar Degas. Danseuse attachant le ruban de son soulier, generously donated tonight by Mr. Adrien Dubois and Mrs. Isabella Rossi Dubois. A wave of applause filled the room as a spotlight hit the small, exquisite bronze sculpture on a velvet pedestal. The bidding started at a staggering $1 million. Hands shot up around the room. The price climbed rapidly, $2,034,000. Adrian and Isabella watched with quiet smiles, having already made their contribution. They were merely spectators now. And then Jack saw his opening. It was a mad, reckless idea born of desperation and ego. He would buy the statue. He would outbid them all buy the very object of their generosity. And in doing so, he would symbolically dominate them. He would prove that his pockets were just as deep, his power just as real. $5 million a bidder near the front offered. $6 million came a counteroffer. Jack stood up. The movement was abrupt, drawing the eyes of those at nearby tables. Chloe looked at him in alarm. $10 million, Jack boomed, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent hall. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The auctioneer's eyes widened. He knew a grudge match when he saw one. He looked towards the other bidders, who all lowered their hands. This was a battle they wanted no part of. $10 million from Mr. Jack Davenport, the auctioneer cried. Do I hear 11 silence? Jack's heart pounded. A triumphant smirk spread across his face. He glanced at the head table. Isabella's expression was unreadable, a mask of calm. Adrian watched him, not with anger, but with a look of detached curiosity, like a physicist observing a predictable but disappointing chemical reaction. Going once. The auctioneer sang. Going twice. Jack felt a surge of victory. He had done it. He had silenced the room, seized the spotlight. Sold. The auctioneer shouted, banging his gavel. To Mr. Jack Davenport for $10 million. A wave of polite, if slightly stunned applause trickled through the room. Jack sat down, puffing out his chest. He had made his statement. He was still a player. He had turned their grand gesture into his own triumph. The museum director then took the stage to thank everyone. What an incredible night. And what a spectacular final bid. We must thank Mr. Davenport for his astonishing generosity. And of course, our deepest gratitude to our new program co-chairs, Isabella Rossi Dubois and Adrian Dubois, not only for their donation of the dégâts, but for their vision for the future. He gestured to the heat table. Adrian stood up, taking the microphone. Jack leaned back in his chair, ready to endure a boring speech. Thank you. Adrian began his calm voice, commanding instant attention. Isabella and I are thrilled to be part of this institution's next chapter. We believe that technology and art are not separate disciplines, but two sides of the same coin of human innovation. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room before they landed briefly on Jack. Innovation, Adrian continued, is about more than just creating new things. It's also about improving and sometimes dismantling old systems that are no longer efficient or ethical. It's a principle I apply not just in philanthropy, but in business. A strange tension filled the air. This was no longer a standard thank you speech. Speaking of which, Adrian said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming sharper. Aegis Dynamics is always looking for opportunities to innovate across different sectors, which is why I am pleased to informally announce tonight that earlier this afternoon, my board approved the final stages of a majority acquisition of a long-standing Wall Street firm. A firm we believe has great potential once its leadership culture is realigned with modern ethical standards. Jack went cold. His blood felt like ice water in his veins. He knew. He knew before the words were even spoken. Adrian's gaze locked directly onto Jack's. There was no longer any indifference in his eyes. There was only the cold, hard finality of a checkmate. We look forward to the challenge of restructuring the assets and operations of Davenport Capital. The silence in the room was absolute, deafening. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the building. Every single person turned to stare at Jack Davenport. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. His company, the empire he had built on the back of his first wife, the source of all his power and arrogance. Adrian Dubois hadn't just entered his world, he had conquered it, and he had announced it to the world in the most public, most humiliating way possible. The $10 million grandstanding was no longer a show of power. It was the pathetic final roar of a dying animal. He hadn't bought a statue. He had paid a $10 million cover charge to his own public execution. Jack sat, paralyzed, his face ashen. He saw Isabella, who had remained seated. She wasn't smiling or gloating. She simply met his gaze from across the room, and for the first time all night, he saw an emotion in her eyes. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't triumph. It was a flicker of the pity she had shown Chloe in the powder room. It was the look one gives to a thing that is already over. The gavel hadn't just sold a statue. It had signaled the end of his reign. The aftermath was a brutal, silent slaughter. There was no confrontation, no shouting match. There was only the slow, agonizing walk of shame. Jack remained frozen in his chair as the gala began to dissolve around him. People avoided his table as if it were radioactive. The few who met his eye looked away quickly, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. They were distancing themselves from the wreckage. Wall Street is a jungle, and no one lingers near a freshly wounded beast. Chloe was the first to move. She stood up, her crimson dress a bloody slash in the muted light. She looked down at Jack, her face a mask of cold fury and terror. The fantasy was not just over, it had been incinerated. The man she had hitched her star to was a falling meteor. "You fool," she whispered, the words venomous and raw. "You absolute fool." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and fled, not even bothering to collect her wrap, pushing through the dispersing crowd and disappearing into the night. Her liquidation had come sooner than even Isabella had predicted. Slowly, mechanically, Jack got to his feet. He felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on him, even if no one was looking directly. The walk to the exit was the longest of his life. Every step was a fresh humiliation. The grandeur of the great hall now seemed to mock him, its cavernous space amplifying his solitude. As he reached the entrance, he saw them. Isabella and Adrian were waiting for their car under the portico. They weren't speaking, but stood in a comfortable, powerful silence. A black, custom-built Bentley, discreet and impossibly elegant, pulled up to the curb. Their driver, a professional in a dark suit, held the door open. Adrian helped Isabella in his hand, gentle on her arm. Before getting in himself, he looked up and saw Jack standing there, a ghost at the feast. For a moment, their eyes met across the rain-slicked pavement of Fifth Avenue. Adrian gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of victory or of gloating. It was a nod of finality, a closing of a book. Then he slipped into the car and it pulled away, disappearing silently into the stream of New York traffic. Jack was left alone on the curb, the cold night air doing nothing to cool the fire of his humiliation. He had come to the gala to display his power, to put his ex-wife in her place. Instead, he had lost his mistress, his company, and his reputation in the space of 3 hours. He had treated Isabella like a footnote in his life, and she had returned as the author of his demise, not through malice but simply by moving on to a world so far beyond his that her new partner could dismantle his entire existence as a minor business transaction. He finally understood. The $10 million for the statue was now a debt he couldn't pay. His credit lines would be frozen by morning. His board would have already turned on him. He wasn't just ruined, he was erased. Across town, the Bentley moved smoothly through Central Park. Isabella looked out the window at the lights of the city she now saw with new eyes. Adrian reached over and took her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. She turned to him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. It was a smile free from the ghosts of the past, a smile filled with the promise of the future. "I am," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am more than all right." She squeezed his hand. The night hadn't been about revenge. Revenge was a bitter, corrosive thing. This was something cleaner, purer. It was justice. It was the universe rebalancing its scales. Jack hadn't been destroyed by some grand, vindictive plot. He had been destroyed by his own arrogance, by his inability to see the value in what he had and the power in what he had thrown away. He had built his castle on sand, and tonight, the tide had finally come in. And Isabella Rossi Dubois was already sailing on a new, stronger current toward a horizon Jack Davenport would never reach. So the curtain falls on Jack Davenport's empire of ego, a world built by diminishing others, only to be dismantled by the quiet strength of the one person he thought he had erased. This story is more than just a tale of spectacular comeuppance at a glamorous gala. It's a powerful reminder that a person's true worth is never defined by who they are with, but by who they are. Isabella's ultimate victory wasn't in seeing Jack fall, it was in her own rise. It was in building a life so full and authentic that his downfall became little more than a distant echo. What do you think is the most powerful form of revenge, a loud public triumph, or the quiet success of a life well lived? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone so completely underestimate the wrong person? We'd love to hear your stories. If you were captivated by Isabella's journey from forgotten wife to powerhouse, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a story of empowerment and justice, and make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have many more stories like this to share, where the underestimated find their voice and reclaim their power. Thank you for listening.
Millionaire tortured his sick wife, but after she died, the truth made him regret it 1,000 times. In a grand estate perched upon a windswept hill, tragedy and desire intertwined in a way no one could have imagined. Richard Blackwood, a millionaire whose name was whispered in elite social circles, ruled his kingdom with an iron fist. By his side stood Isabella, his delicate wife, whose every breath wavered with an illness that slowly consumed her body. To the outside world, she lived in luxury, wrapped in the most expensive silks, fed on the finest gourmet meals. But behind closed doors, the walls of Blackwood Manor echoed with her whispered sobs. No one knew how deeply Isabella suffered until it was too late. Richard Blackwood was not always a cold-hearted man. In the early days of his youth, he was known among his friends as lively and generous, a cheerful sort who would share his last dollar with a friend in need. After inheriting his grandfather's empire, a vast conglomerate specializing in finance, real estate, and pharmaceuticals, Richard's life changed overnight. Wealth brought power, and power brought temptation. Over time, a bitter cynicism took hold of him, shielding him from the warmth of others' humanity. Still, on the surface, Richard maintained a veneer of respectability. He donated large sums to local charities, including the St. Lucia Children's Hospital, where he once met Dr. Andrew Montague, a soft-spoken pediatrician who quietly disapproved of Richard's abrupt manner. Society columns fawned over the elusive Mr. Blackwood, praising him for his philanthropic efforts and good breeding, as they called it. Behind that polished exterior, however, lay a heart that had hardened against compassion. When Richard met Isabella Laurent, she was nothing like the typical women who tried to catch his eye at social galas and charity events. Isabella was the niece of William Gardner, a close friend to the Blackwood family. She was modest yet elegant, with a quiet poise that struck Richard during their first meeting. At a small dinner party in the Gardner estate, she wore a pastel blue gown that highlighted her delicate features. Her dark hair was pinned back in a simple chignon, and her laughter was light like the sound of distant chimes. It was said that the moment Richard saw her smile, something in him softened, if only for a fleeting second. That night, Isabella and Richard sat next to each other, discussing literature over a 3-course meal. She recounted her love for classic novels by the fireplace, and he spoke of his ambitions for his newly inherited empire. It was one of those rare moments when Richard's armor slipped, revealing glimpses of the man he had once been: compassionate, spirited, and yearning for genuine connection. Months passed quickly in a whirl of discreet dates and candle-lit dinners. Their relationship developed with surprising speed. Friends remarked how Isabella seemed to bring out a gentler side of Richard. Even Dr. Andrew Montague noticed a change in the man. Richard had started dropping by the hospital with donations and would sometimes inquire after the children's welfare more earnestly. But no romance exists in a vacuum, and neither did theirs. Rumors spread that Richard's fortune had begun experiencing hidden troubles. The real estate arm of his conglomerate faced a legal challenge from environmental activists. Certain business associates whispered that Richard had grown more controlling and paranoid behind the scenes. He insisted on reading all the financial reports himself, scrutinizing every line as if waiting for a betrayal. Still, Isabella stood by him, unwavering. In private, she would assure him that no matter what happened, she had faith in his capacity to triumph over his struggles. She believed in the fundamental goodness that she saw within him, even when he doubted himself. Perhaps that unwavering belief in the face of turmoil was what led her to marry him after just a year of courtship. Their wedding was a lavish affair, a regal ceremony at the Blackwood Manor's private chapel, followed by a reception in the garden. White orchids, Isabella's favorite flowers, cascaded down marble pillars, and the estate glowed under thousands of fairy lights. For a time, it was bliss. They traveled to Europe for their honeymoon, visiting cathedrals and art galleries. Isabella kept a small leather-bound journal in which she jotted down tiny details of their journey: how the moon lit the Seine on their midnight stroll in Paris, how Richard had smiled at a group of local children performing by the Piazza San Marco in Venice. In those early days, happiness was real, tangible, but shadows often lurk in the corners of even the brightest rooms. Returning to Blackwood Manor, they found that Isabella's health began to falter. It started with simple fatigue. She would tire halfway up the grand staircase. Then migraines tormented her at night. She'd wake up trembling from feverish dreams. As her condition worsened, the doctors were baffled. Test after test came back inconclusive. Dr. Andrew Montague, now a trusted friend, recommended specialists across the country. But nobody could pinpoint the exact nature of her ailment. Richard, initially alarmed, poured money into researching the best medical solutions. He brought in private caregivers. He personally escorted her to the top neurological and immunological experts. At night, he sat by her bedside, reminding her of the stories they shared on their honeymoon. Yet as the weeks turned to months, and months slid inexorably into a year, his patience began to wear thin. Stress from his faltering businesses piled on, and mounting debts from the expansions he had pursued weighed heavily on his shoulders. He grew irritable and remote. Perhaps the shifting economy bore down on him, or perhaps it was the heartbreak of watching Isabella suffer without any clear diagnosis. One moment, he would hold her hand tenderly, promising to stand by her. The next, he'd snap at her for the smallest things, an innocuous question, a worried glance. The staff at Blackwood Manor could see the tension building like dark clouds on a horizon. None of them could have predicted just how bad it would get, nor how much Isabella would endure in silence before everything came crashing down. For the first 6 months following Isabella's deterioration, Richard clung to the hope that her condition would improve. He hired private nurses around the clock, including Caroline Peterson, whose name was well regarded among the wealthy families along the East Coast for her compassionate bedside manner. Caroline was gentle and efficient, ensuring Isabella received her medications on time and her vital signs were monitored meticulously. Through night shifts and early mornings, Caroline maintained a calm, reassuring presence that gave Isabella a semblance of normalcy. But as the seasons changed outside the estate's sprawling gardens, summer flowers giving way to autumn leaves, Richard's behavior took on a sharper edge. He would question Caroline's methods, accusing her of inefficiency if Isabella so much as coughed unexpectedly. He demanded that every test result be delivered to him immediately, not trusting the medical team to interpret anything correctly. Anxiety and anger seemed to fuel him, and in turn, Richard took on more of the caretaker role himself, almost obsessively. One early evening, Dr. Andrew Montague arrived at Blackwood Manor to review Isabella's newest test results. In the past, Richard would greet the doctor in the foyer or invite him into the study for a glass of brandy. This time, Andrew found himself waiting in the parlour for nearly half an hour, listening to muffled arguments from behind a closed door. When Richard finally emerged, his face was flushed, and he spoke in clipped, cold tones. "Dr. Montague," he said, barely looking at him, "Caroline has the file for you. Make sure everything's in order." Andrew tried to inquire about the argument he had overheard, but Richard brushed it off, claiming it was a personal matter. Concern flickered across the doctor's face. He was worried not only about Isabella's failing health, but also about Richard's mental state. After all, Andrew had known him for a decade. He had seen the transformations in the man's demeanor. Once upstairs, Andrew examined Isabella. Her condition had worsened from the last time. Her skin was pallid, dark circles etched under her eyes. She winced whenever he touched her wrists to check her pulse. Caroline informed him that Isabella had new symptoms, occasional memory lapses, moments of disorientation that left her frightened. Each time, Richard's frustration seemed to grow. Isabella tried to smile. "I'm all right, really." "It's just a bad day," she whispered weakly, forcing warmth into her eyes. Andrew could see the sorrow behind them. He recommended a new MRI scan to check for any neurological abnormalities missed by previous tests. Isabella nodded, her voice trembled when she thanked him for his concern. That night, a storm raged outside. Thunderclaps shook the windows, and lightning forked across the sky. In their bedroom, Isabella lay trembling under the covers. Her sickness made her vulnerable to the sudden noise. Unable to sleep, she silently watched Richard, who paced the floor in agitation. "We'll get the results back in 2 days," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "We have to figure this out, or we'll go broke with these endless tests." Though his tone was harsh, Isabella recognized a kernel of real terror in his words, fear of losing her, losing control, and losing the fortune he had worked so hard to expand. She reached out a trembling hand to him, wanting to offer comfort, but he flinched away, heading to the window to watch the rain. As the storm pressed on through the night, a different kind of tempest brewed inside Richard's mind. His business empire was buckling under intense pressure, with shareholders demanding reassurances and debts piling up. Meanwhile, every new doctor's visit for Isabella siphoned more money from his estate. He convinced himself that if he just pushed hard enough for answers, for treatments, some solution would appear. But the more he fought, the more powerless he felt. Powerlessness was an emotion Richard Blackwood had never been equipped to handle. Instead, he lashed out. He demanded that Isabella try new experimental drugs, or insisted she undergo additional invasive procedures. He wanted progress, visible proof that the woman he loved would not slip away. When each measure failed to yield immediate improvement, he accused her of not trying hard enough or of exaggerating her pain. He clung to the idea that Isabella's symptoms were somehow within her control, a perspective that slowly veered into cruelty. Caroline Peterson, the private nurse, was the first to confront him. She approached him one late afternoon in the Manor's Grand Library, where he was reviewing stock market reports. Timidly, she expressed concern that Isabella needed more emotional support, not just medical tests. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice hesitant, "your wife is frightened. She's in pain. These new rounds of tests are very stressful. Could we slow down, for her sake, until we see some results?" His reaction was immediate fury. Slamming his tablet on the mahogany desk, he spat, "You dare question my judgment? Her condition gets worse by the day, and you want me to sit idly by? Who's paying your salary, Miss Peterson?" Caroline froze. "Of course, sir. I'm not questioning your intentions. I only enough," he snapped, forcing her to retreat, tears threatening in her eyes. "Do your job, or I'll find someone else who can." From that day forward, Caroline found herself treading carefully around him, speaking only in hushed tones when necessary, fearful of stoking his temper. She reported everything to Dr. Montague, who became increasingly alarmed at the atmosphere in Blackwood Manor, so he arranged to visit again, unannounced. Yet each time Andrew tried to talk sense into Richard, it was like speaking to a man drowning in darkness. Richard refused to concede any point, convinced he alone could save his wife by sheer force of will. In the months that followed, the estate's staff noticed changes in Isabella. She began to lose not just her physical strength, but also her once bright spirit. She seldom left her room, scarcely ate a full meal, and flinched whenever Richard entered the room. Late at night, if one passed her bedroom door, they might hear soft crying. And if they listened more closely, they might catch fragments of Richard's angry rants, accusations that Isabella was a burden, that she was draining him financially, emotionally, and socially. None of them knew how far Richard would go, or how deeply Isabella's sorrow would carve out her heart in the coming days. They only sensed that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Inside the centuries-old walls of Blackwood Manor, corridors seemed to stretch into darkness. The tapestry-lined hallways bore silent witness to the tension rising between husband and wife. Richard's footsteps echoed day and night, his mood shifting erratically. Sometimes he would spend hours by Isabella's side, fussing over her blankets, rereading test results, or demanding the nurses keep a closer eye on her. Other times he would vanish into his private study, locking the door behind him to brood over financial ledgers. Isabella, frail and burdened by illness, found solace in only two things. The first was her journal, a tiny leather-bound notebook where she penned her innermost thoughts, prayers and fears. The second was the old greenhouse attached to the manor, an abandoned relic of a time when Richard's grandmother cultivated rare orchids. Isabella often asked Caroline or another nurse to escort her there when she could muster the strength, to sit among the neglected plants and just breathe. One morning, as a thin winter sun struggled through the frosted glass of the greenhouse, Isabella's trembling hand clutched her journal. Caroline, discreetly watering a few surviving succulents, noticed how tears slipped down Isabella's cheeks. She approached carefully. "Madam, are you all right? Can I get you anything?" Isabella shook her head, her eyes vacant. "I'm just thinking about what I can't say aloud." "It helps to write." Caroline hesitated, torn between professional boundaries and genuine concern. Finally, she said, "If you ever need to confide in someone, I'm here to listen." Isabella managed a wan smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Unbeknownst to either of them, Richard stood just beyond a row of potted ferns, quietly observing, his eyes narrowed, suspicion flaring. He had become strangely paranoid in recent weeks, convinced that Isabella was hiding secrets from him, secrets about her health, or maybe about her intentions. He reasoned that her family might encourage her to sue him for negligence, or that she planned to leave him. The constant swirl of anxieties in his mind made him see conspiracies in every shadow. He stepped forward, startling them both. "Isabella," he said, voice low, "you're out of bed." She looked up, startled. "I needed some fresh air. Caroline was kind enough to bring me here." Richard surveyed the scene, looking at the journal clasped in her hands. "What are you writing, my dear?" Her grip on the notebook tightened. "Just personal thoughts. Nothing to worry about." Caroline intervened. "Mr. Blackwood, the greenhouse environment seems to help Miss S. Blackwood relax." She seemed better today. His gaze flicked to Caroline, cold and piercing. "Go inside," he ordered. "I wish to speak to my wife alone." Caroline's eyes darted to Isabella, concerned, but she had no choice but to leave. A heavy silence settled over the greenhouse. Richard stepped closer, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding ominously final. "You know you can talk to me," he began, his tone deceptively gentle. "I've done everything for you, haven't I?" Isabella's eyes welled with tears. She wanted to believe in that gentle note in his voice, that the man she had once fallen in love with was still there. But the memory of his angry outbursts and the sting of his accusations remained fresh. "I do talk to you, Richard," she replied softly, "but sometimes I need to sort out my thoughts first." He slowly extended his hand, palm up. "Let me see what you wrote." Her heart pounded. Inside those pages were confessions of her isolation, her anguish at his cruelty, and her longing for the kindness he once showed. She feared what might happen if he read them. Gathering her courage, she shook her head. "These are my private reflections, Richard." His face hardened, an edge of hostility flaring. "Private? In my house? I pay for everything here, including your medical bills. Do you think you can hide something from me?" Pain lanced through Isabella's chest. She hugged the journal to her chest. "Richard, please." He grabbed her wrist, not forcefully enough to injure, but with a firm, threatening grip. "You're trembling. Are you cold or afraid of me?" She didn't answer. Tears spilled down her cheeks. After a tense moment, he let go of her, turning sharply away. "Go back to bed," he ordered. "The greenhouse is no place for you in your condition." With that, he stomped off, leaving her feeling small and wretched. tears silently marking her sorrow. That night, Isabella tried to talk to him. She wanted to remind him of their love, their promises. She recalled that day at the Gardner estate when they first met. She remembered the joy in his eyes, the day they waltzed in their private suite after their wedding. But every time she tried to bring it up, his phone rang or he dismissed her with a wave of his hand, consumed by business calls. A new rumor had surfaced that Richard's pharmaceutical wing was under federal investigation for malpractices regarding a newly developed cancer drug. The same drug that was, ironically, recommended for Isabella's experimental treatment. He was furious, raving about possible conspiracies. He snapped at her if she mentioned anything about the investigation, telling her it was none of her concern. In the eyes of Blackwood Manor staff, her well-being became overshadowed by his searing obsession with saving his empire. Weeks trickled by, each day longer than the last. Isabella's condition showed no signs of improvement. She lost weight, her cheeks sunk, and she often lay in bed, too exhausted to even read. Richard, frustrated, sought out second and third opinions, demanding immediate solutions. Doctors, intimidated by his status and short temper, did their best but had no conclusive answers. One cold January evening, a harrowing incident changed the atmosphere entirely. Isabella woke, gasping for air, her face pale and her breath ragged. A panicked Caroline rushed to administer oxygen. Doctor! Montague arrived within the hour, and for a horrifying moment, they feared Isabella might not make it through the night. After stabilizing her, Montague confronted Richard in the hallway. "You're pushing her too hard," the doctor accused. "These new procedures, the stress, it's too much for her. She needs stability, not more chaos." Richard's eyes blazed. "Chaos is what's going on in my business. I won't sit here and watch her die while you do nothing. If you can't help her, I'll find someone else who will." Montague swallowed his frustration. "This is beyond any single doctor's capability. We need thorough evaluations. We need to give her peace and time to rest." "You're suffocating her with demands," Richard sneered. "Don't tell me how to take care of my wife." That night, in a fit of paranoid rage, Richard searched Isabella's bedroom while she slept, rummaging through drawers, opening cabinets. He found her journal tucked under her pillow, but he only thumbed through the first page before his conscience, or whatever remained of it, stopped him. He realized that if he read further, he might see himself in a monstrous light, and deep down, perhaps a part of him feared that truth. He placed the journal back exactly where he found it, returning to his own room with fists clenched. Sleep eluded him as guilt and anger warred in his mind. Outside, the old oak trees rattled in the winter wind, their branches scraping against the estate walls like ghostly fingers, as though the house itself was warning him of what was to come. Tension in Blackwood Manor reached a breaking point as February's chill set in. Instead of seeking solace in each other, Richard and Isabella existed like strangers. They inhabited the same house, but their conversations were painfully brief, mostly about her treatments or about finances. The gap that once might have been bridged by love was now widened by fear, suspicion, and unresolved pain. Desperate for relief, Isabella requested to see an old friend, Mary Thompson, a woman she had known since childhood. Mary was a gentle soul who traveled extensively as a missionary nurse in Southeast Asia. Upon hearing Isabella's plea, Mary immediately arrived, her concern palpable. She was shocked by Isabella's frail appearance, and the anxiety etched into her face. They met in Isabella's bedroom, a place that should have been a tranquil sanctuary, but instead felt oppressive, with the heavy curtains drawn and the constant hum of medical equipment. Mary embraced her, tears shining in her eyes. "Oh, Isabella, I wish I had come sooner," she whispered. Isabella clung to her. He's different, Mary," she said, voice cracking. "I don't know if it's my illness or something else, but it feels like he's slipping away from me." Mary listened, heartbroken by her friend's plight. Over the following days, she tried to speak with Richard, attempting to remind him of the joys and wonders of the early days of his marriage. But he was guarded, polite, but distant. Whenever Mary tried to approach the subject of his apparent hostility, he changed topics abruptly or claimed pressing business matters. Then, one afternoon, Mary discovered something peculiar while talking to Caroline in the Manor's kitchen. There was a large volume of prescription drugs delivered each week, far more than what Isabella's doctors had officially authorized. When Mary pressed Caroline on this, the nurse explained that Richard insisted on keeping a stocked supply of various experimental medications. He believed in proactive treatment, or so he claimed, but Caroline found the quantity alarming. Worse, Mary noticed that some of the drugs stored in the locked cupboard near Isabella's room had never been used before, and no doctor was prescribing them. It was as if Richard was hoarding medication in the desperate hope of stumbling upon a cure. Or perhaps, she thought grimly, there was another reason entirely. One evening, Mary took a walk down the dim corridor leading to Richard's study. She found the door slightly ajar, and inside, Richard was on the phone, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. She caught snippets of the conversation, talk of funds being depleted, covering up allegations, and keeping her condition confidential. Mary's stomach churned as she pieced together the implications. It sounded like Richard was juggling not just his wife's illness, but also a scandal that could ruin him. Was he seeing Isabella more as a liability than a beloved partner? As Mary prepared to leave the manor that night, she paused at Isabella's door. She heard whimpering inside. Carefully she stepped in and found Isabella curled on the bed, her journal clutched to her chest. Tear tracks glistened on her cheeks. "Bella?" Mary whispered, using Isabella's nickname from their youth. "I've written down everything," Isabella murmured, her voice hollow. "I wrote about his anger, the money trouble, and how I feel trapped. I'm afraid he's going to hate me more if he sees this, but I also feel like I need it, so that I remember who I am." Mary's heart broke. "You won't be trapped forever," she consoled. "I promise. We'll figure something out. Is there anywhere else you can go? Another family member?" Isabella shook her head. "No, I can't leave. I can't. My body is too weak. And a part of me still hopes that the man I love is still in there." Mary stayed the night, sleeping on a chaise beside Isabella's bed. She held her friend's hand as the hours ticked by in oppressive silence. In the middle of the night, Isabella jerked awake from a nightmare, her hair drenched in sweat. She gasped, shaking. "He was screaming at me," she sobbed, "telling me I was worthless." Mary wrapped her arms around her until she calmed. When morning came, Mary was resolved to approach Richard directly. She found him in the dining hall reading the newspapers. "Good morning," she said, mustering courage. He glanced up, eyes cold. "Mary, leaving today?" she inhaled. "I want to talk to you about Isabella." Richard folded the newspaper, setting it aside. "I'm listening. She's afraid of you," Mary began, cutting straight to the point. "Something is deeply wrong here, Richard. I don't know if it's your financial troubles or stress over her condition, but you're hurting her more than helping." His jaw tightened. "I suggest you mind your own business. Isabella is my wife. I'm doing my best. Your best is terrifying her." Mary couldn't contain the tremor in her voice. "She's ill, Richard, and she needs compassion, not threats and constant pressure. If you truly love her, you'll step back, His fist slammed down on the table, rattling the china. "You have no idea what I'm going through. The expansions, the lawsuits, the hospital bills. She doesn't deserve half the sacrifices I've made for her. She sits there complaining while I bleed my finances dry to find a cure for something no doctor can identify." Mary felt a surge of protectiveness. "That's her life, Richard, not some commodity you can buy and fix. She's suffering." He stood abruptly, pointing to the door. "Get out. Now, you're trespassing on my patience." She met his gaze, refusing to cower. "You will regret this," she said softly. "If anything happens to her, anything, you will regret it 1,000 times." With that, she left, her heart pounding and tears threatening to fall. She felt helpless, uncertain how to protect Isabella if she refused to leave. All Mary could do was pray that the gentle woman she loved like a sister would not be consumed by Richard's growing darkness. In the ensuing weeks, Isabella's health spiraled downward at an alarming rate. Once or twice she tried to confide in Richard about her nightmares and creeping despair. Every time, he brushed her off, claiming that her negativity was fueling her illness. Worse, he began isolating her from outside contact. Calls from Mary and Dr. Montague were monitored, and staff were forbidden from discussing Isabella's condition with anyone outside the manor. Even Caroline Peterson found her movements restricted. She could only tend to Isabella under Richard's watchful eye. At night, she'd retreat to the small room allocated to her in the servants' wing, uneasy about what she witnessed. Sometimes distant cries and muffled arguments drifted through the hallways, always followed by a tense, suffocating stillness. One particular evening, Caroline found Isabella sobbing quietly in her bed after dinner. The tray of food lay untouched. Her eyes were swollen from tears, and bruises lined her wrists. Bruises she tried to hide under the covers. Fearing the worst, Caroline gently asked, "Did Richard do this to you, ma'am?" Isabella didn't answer right away. Her lip trembled and fresh tears spilled. Finally she choked out, "It was an accident." He was angry about some business deal that fell through. I tried to calm him, but he grabbed me by the arm. He didn't mean to. Caroline's throat tightened. "Isabella, this is not all right. You don't deserve this. What can I do? I can call Mary or Doctor Montague." "No, please," Isabella pleaded, her voice trembling. "Richard forbade any outside help. If he finds out, it will only make things worse." Caroline struggled with her ethical duty. Her instinct screamed that this was domestic abuse, that she should call authorities or get someone else involved. But she also feared for Isabella's safety if she defied Richard. She resolved to find a moment to call Dr. Montague in secret. That night, Richard stormed into Isabella's bedroom, pacing around like a caged animal. "Did you take your medication?" he demanded, his tone clipped. Isabella nodded weakly. He eyed her suspiciously. "All of it?" "Yes," she whispered, terrified by his abruptness. He sat down beside her, an odd mix of rage and desperation in his eyes. "I can't lose you," he said, voice tight. "Do you understand? I've poured everything into finding a cure, my resources, my energy. If you don't survive..." He trailed off, a haunted look passing over his features. She stared at him, wanting to reach out, to remind him of the vows they had taken. But there was a distance between them now that felt insurmountable. She realized with painful clarity that she no longer recognized the man before her. "Richard," she began softly, "I don't need expensive treatments or the best doctors in the world. I just need you to be there for me. I need your kindness, your love." He scoffed, rising to his feet. "I'm doing what I must. Love? Love won't pay for the hospital bills when you go back for another experimental therapy. Love won't keep my shareholders at bay. If I fail, it's the end of everything our family built." Her gaze dropped to her hands. Sometimes it's not about building more, but preserving what truly matters. Angered by her words, he kicked the nightstand, nearly toppling a vase. Isabella jumped, startled by his violence. Richard left the room without another word, slamming the door behind him. Days later, Dr. Montague tried to visit unannounced. Richard refused him entry, threatening legal action if the doctor didn't leave. Stunned and worried, Montague managed to slip Caroline his phone number, urging her to call whenever she could. As winter melted into the early hints of spring, Isabella's condition grew dire. She experienced frequent fainting spells and had difficulty breathing. One night, after collapsing in the hallway, she lay unconscious for almost 3 minutes before Caroline could revive her. Richard, unhinged by fear, began blaming her for refusing to fight. "She's given up," he ranted to Caroline in the library. "She's not even trying anymore. All she does is complain and mope around. I won't tolerate it." Caroline was aghast. "Sir, she's dying. She's not choosing this. It's—" "Shut up," he roared, slamming a book onto the table. "Do not speak to me about choice. I've sacrificed enough. If she won't fight, I'll make her fight. If the only way to get her back is to force her, I will." In that moment, Caroline felt truly frightened for Isabella. She locked herself in her quarters, managing to send a brief message to Dr. Montague. "She's in danger. He's losing control. Please help." She waited for a reply, uncertain if it would come in time. The next day proved tragic. Isabella grew delirious with fever. She wandered the halls, calling out incoherently for Mary, for her late parents, for Richard, sometimes mistaking staff for her mother. When Richard found her in this delirious state, he snapped. He dragged her by the arm to her bedroom, insisting she take another dose of medication that hadn't even been prescribed by her primary doctor. Isabella resisted, half screaming, half pleading for him to stop. Their argument escalated in the worst way. In the heat of his rage, he shoved her onto the bed. Her head struck the headboard, and she crumpled, eyes rolling back. For an agonizing moment, Richard froze in horror at what he'd done. Caroline rushed in, blood draining from her face as she called for an ambulance. Isabella was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Dr. Montague met them there, his expression grim as paramedics wheeled her into the emergency ward. Richard paced the waiting area, shock etched into his features. Hours later, the doctors emerged, telling him that Isabella was in a coma. Her weakened body had finally given out, and there was significant swelling in her brain. Richard felt something shatter inside him as he sank into a chair. He was left with one haunting thought: this can't be happening. But deep down, he knew he had crossed a line that day, perhaps one that could never be uncrossed. Isabella lingered in the coma for 2 agonizing weeks. Each day, the doctors updated Richard with the same bleak news. Her vitals were unstable, her brain activity minimal, and her prognosis uncertain. Guilt gnawed at him, steadily eroding the armor of denial he had built around himself. He practically lived in the hospital, pacing the corridors, ignoring the stares of nurses who had heard rumors of what happened. He spent nights slumped in a chair beside Isabella's bed, resting his head on the sterile sheets. Sometimes, in a moment of restless half-sleep, he would dream of their honeymoon in Paris, of Isabella's laughter echoing under the glittering Eiffel Tower. Then he would wake to the beep of life support machines and the haunting sight of his wife, frail and unmoving. Dr. Montague was equally exhausted, though in a different way. Having fought for Isabella's well-being for months, he was now bearing witness to her final, precarious state. He confronted Richard whenever he could, but the millionaire often brushed him aside, lost in self-recrimination. "You should have listened to us," Andrew finally said one morning, cornering Richard in the hallway. "She needed care, not constant stress. She needed you to be a husband, not a warden." Richard clenched his jaw, staring at the floor. "I know. I can't undo what's been done." During Isabella's second week in the coma, something unexpected happened. A nurse, while changing the linens in her hospital room, discovered Isabella's small leather-bound journal hidden in the folds of her blanket. She handed it to Dr. Montague. He recognized it immediately from Isabella's old habit of journaling. Unsure what to do, he decided to read it, hoping it might offer clues about her condition, or perhaps a final testament of her wishes. Montague carefully flipped through the pages. His eyes flicked over Isabella's neat, looping script. She wrote about her pain, her loneliness, her confusion over Richard's behavior, and her desperate hope that he would return to her as the loving man she married. She described the times he lost his temper, how frightened she felt, how she rationalized his bursts of anger as the product of stress. But each page became more heartbreaking than the last. Deeper in the journal, there was a startling passage. It revealed that Isabella had been secretly meeting with a personal attorney, Marcus Bellows, to draw up a philanthropic trust. The trust's purpose? To channel a portion of her inheritance, which she had received from her late aunt, into medical research for rare diseases. She wrote that she never told Richard about the trust, fearing that his deteriorating empathy and obsession with financial control would lead him to shut it down. She wanted to make a difference, to give purpose to her suffering by helping others. She also mentioned she suspected her own illness might be among those rare diseases that the research could someday address. The shock that truly rattled Dr. Montague was her repeated worry that Richard would misunderstand her secret philanthropy as a betrayal. She noted that she wanted to reveal it to him once her trust was legally secure, hoping it might rekindle his belief in helping others rather than succumbing to greed. Toward the end, she wrote in shaky handwriting, "If I die before I can tell him the truth, I pray he finds forgiveness and learns that love cannot be bought or forced, it can only be given, freely and wholeheartedly." With shaking hands, Dr. Montague shared the journal entries with Mary Thompson, who had rushed back to town when she heard about Isabella's coma. Together, they debated whether Richard should see it. Mary argued that he needed to know the truth, even if it tore him apart. Dr. Montague agreed. Later that day, they found Richard in the hospital cafeteria, staring blankly at a cup of untouched coffee. His eyes were hollow, rimmed with dark circles. Dr. Montague slid the journal across the table. "Read it," Mary said, her voice tight with emotion. Richard looked confused, picking up the worn notebook. As he read Isabella's words, page by page, tears formed in his eyes, his face twisted with anguish. He saw how she had never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping for him. She had hidden her philanthropic efforts, not out of deceit, but out of a deep fear that his controlling nature would sabotage her dream. She had, in essence, tried to protect him from himself, hoping one day he'd see the light in her act of generosity. When he finished reading, Richard's eyes brimmed with tears that finally spilled onto the pages. He clutched the journal to his chest, gasping for breath as though he'd been punched in the gut. All his anger, paranoia, and cruelty, the reckless drive that led him to harm the one person he claimed to love, came crashing down in that single moment of realization. Mary's voice cut through the silence. "She was trying to help you, Richard. She believed in you, even when you gave her every reason not to." His voice cracked. I never knew. I thought she was plotting against me, draining my finances. But she wanted to help people. And he couldn't finish his sentence. Sobs choking him. For Mary, it was painfully bittersweet to see him finally stripped of his anger, replaced now with regret that would likely haunt him forever. Wordlessly, Dr. Montague laid a hand on Richard's shoulder. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, letting him cry into the open pages of Isabella's greatest secret. Neither Mary nor Montague could bring themselves to hate him entirely, even after everything. They saw a broken man, cracked open by the truth of the damage he had done. Now, the question lingered in the stale hospital air. Would this revelation come in time for Richard to make amends to the woman lying comatose, her fate uncertain? On the 15th day of Isabella's coma, her doctors delivered a grim bulletin. Her brain function had deteriorated. If she ever woke, she would likely be severely disabled. The news shattered Richard all over again. Each day since reading her journal, he had sat at her bedside, tearfully apologizing, replaying their memories in his mind. He had the journal with him constantly, rereading her words, her hopes, her trust in his better nature. Every line felt like a knife, twisting in his chest. Mary and Dr. Montague visited often, offering emotional support. Still, no one could truly soothe the regret that consumed him. He was forced to confront the monstrous side of himself that had pushed Isabella to such despair. The staff at the hospital treated him with a mixture of pity and quiet disdain, but Richard scarcely noticed. His entire world had narrowed down to Isabella's hospital room and the fragile thread of life that bound her to this world. One drab afternoon, while a light rain pattered against the hospital windows, Richard found Isabella's hand stirring faintly. He jumped from his chair, heart pounding, her eyelids fluttered. "Isabella?" He breathed, pressing his lips to her knuckles. She opened her eyes, though they remained cloudy and distant. Her chest rose in shallow breaths, and her gaze flicked around the room, uncertain. She looked at Richard with a flicker of recognition, then a tear slid down her cheek. Richard pressed the call button, frantic, summoning nurses. Dr. Montague arrived swiftly. With gentle instructions, he tested her reflexes and tried to gauge her awareness. Isabella could barely speak, a rasp escaping her throat. They managed to understand a few words, Richard. The first, "Sorry." Her apology broke him. "No," he choked out, tears streaming. "You have nothing to be sorry for. I'm the one." His voice trembled, and he gripped her hand, as if letting go would mean losing her forever. Over the next 2 days, Isabella drifted between fleeting moments of partial consciousness and deep confusion. Sometimes she'd call out for her mother or Mary, not remembering where she was. Other times she seemed to lock her gaze on Richard, as if trying to convey 1,000 unspoken words in her frail state. On the 3rd day after she regained partial consciousness, Mary was by her side, reciting prayers softly. Dr. Montague stood near the window, scanning her most recent vitals. Richard sat close to the bed, gently stroking Isabella's hair. She blinked slowly, her face pale as porcelain. In a trembling whisper, she called out for Richard. He leaned in. "Yes, my love, I'm here." "Home," she murmured. "Can we go home?" Richard's heart twisted. "If the doctors say it's safe, yes. I'll take you anywhere you want." Her lips twitched into what could have been a faint smile. "The greenhouse. Want to see. The flowers." Again, tears slipped down his cheeks as he nodded. "We will, I promise. I'll have it restored. The greenhouse will be filled with new blooms for you." He tried to keep his voice steady, fighting the fear that she might never actually make it out of the hospital. That night, Isabella's condition took a sharp turn. Her organs began to fail from the stress her body endured. Alarms beeped, nurses and doctors rushed in. Richard was ushered out, helplessly watching through the glass panel as they attempted to stabilize her. Mary clung to him, tears streaming down both their faces. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Montague emerged, exhausted. She's not responding to treatment. There's nothing else we can do." His voice wavered, the weight of the words nearly too much to bear. Richard swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "I want to be with her," he whispered. They led him into the room. Isabella lay motionless, a shell of the vibrant woman he once knew. He sat down beside her, taking her hand in both of his. Guilt and sorrow pressed on his chest like a suffocating vice. He pressed his forehead to hers, remembering the early days of their courtship, the stolen kisses, the laughter, her boundless compassion. "I'm so sorry," he breathed, "for everything. If I could trade places with you, I would." Her eyes fluttered open briefly, clouded with pain, but she seemed to recognize him. Her lips parted in a weak attempt to speak. Richard leaned closer. She managed one final shallow breath, and then her eyes closed, her entire body going limp. A hush fell over the room as the monitors emitted a continuous, piercing tone. Her heart had stopped. Nurses hurried in, starting CPR, but within minutes they ceased their efforts at Dr. Montague's signal. She was gone. Richard wept into Isabella's hair, cradling her lifeless body. Mary turned away, tears streaming, while Dr. Montague bowed his head, lips moving in silent prayer. In that moment, Richard realized the full magnitude of his loss. He had driven away the only person who loved him unconditionally, and no wealth or power in the world could bring her back. The funeral took place a week later, a subdued ceremony in the private chapel of Blackwood Manor. A few close acquaintances and family friends attended, though many had distanced themselves in the aftermath of rumors about Richard's abusive behavior. The staff hovered discreetly in the background, some of them in tears. They had seen Isabella's kindness firsthand. Richard stood near the closed coffin, black suit immaculately pressed, but his face drawn and hollow. He had aged 10 years in those final weeks. When the officiant asked if anyone wished to share memories of Isabella, Mary Thompson stepped forward. She spoke of Isabella's gentle spirit, her unwavering faith, and her quiet acts of generosity. Each word felt like a blow to Richard's guilt-ridden mind. After the service, people filed out into the courtyard. Mary approached Richard. In her hands was the leather-bound journal. She extended it to him. "She would want you to keep it," Mary said softly. Richard's lip quivered. He accepted the journal, cradling it like a precious relic. "Thank you," was all he could manage. In the days that followed, a deep silence settled over Blackwood Manor. Most of the staff were given extended leave, and Caroline Peterson found employment elsewhere. She felt unable to stay in the house, haunted by Isabella's final suffering. Dr. Montague likewise distanced himself, though he remained in occasional contact via phone calls, urging Richard to seek therapy. Alone in his study, Richard pored over his finances. The estate teetered on the brink of ruin. Lawsuits and investigations had escalated, his name tarnished by the press speculating on domestic abuse. Shareholders demanded a leadership change in his conglomerate. Strangely, he felt none of his old drive to salvage his empire. Without Isabella, the money seemed meaningless. Late one night, while rummaging through the documents in a desk drawer, he stumbled upon a sealed envelope addressed to him in Isabella's handwriting. His heart pounded as he carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, dated just a month before her coma. "Dearest Richard, I know we've been struggling, and I see the weight you carry. Despite the pain, I still believe in the man I love. The one who'd walk through fire for me if he could. I know you've lost faith in yourself, but I haven't. I'm writing to you because there's a trust I've set up for rare disease research. It's my way of making sense of my illness, to ensure no one else suffers without answers. I feared telling you, worried you'd be angry, but I hope you can find it in your heart to support this mission, even if it seems foolish to you right now. One day, this research might save someone else, maybe even me, if it happens in time. If you're reading this, I suppose my fears were valid, and circumstances have turned dark. But remember, Richard, that love is not about ownership or control. It's about giving without demands, trusting without fear. If you can learn this lesson, our hardships won't have been in vain. I love you, and always will. Your Isabella tears blurred his vision. She had known he might become enraged, yet she still wrote this letter in hope. A new wave of regret and longing crashed over him. He realized that the only way he might ever find a sliver of peace was to fulfill her final wish. And so Richard Blackwood did the one thing that might redeem his tortured conscience. He called Marcus Bellows, Isabella's attorney. He pledged his cooperation in fully funding the philanthropic trust. Despite the precarious state of his finances, he sold his shares in multiple ventures, liquidated assets, anything to ensure that Isabella's trust would be established exactly as she intended. Word spread quietly of Richard's transformation. Some called it a cynical ploy to rebuild his public image. But those who knew him closely, like Dr. Montague, recognized genuine remorse. Richard also sought therapy, confronting his guilt, his anger, and the toxic ambition that drove him to madness. Therapy was not a quick fix, nor did it erase what he had done, but it began a process of self-reflection and accountability. Months later, the trust launched officially under Isabella's name, the Isabella Blackwood Foundation for Rare Disease Research. A modest ceremony took place in the greenhouse at Blackwood Manor, now fully restored and bursting with exotic flowers. Mary was invited and accepted. Dr. Montague was there too, as well as a handful of scientists and physicians dedicated to the foundation's cause. Richard stood at the podium, addressing the small group. His voice trembled. "This greenhouse was Isabella's refuge," he said. "She always found hope in growth, in nature's resilience. I destroyed much of that hope in her, and for that I will always be sorry. But in her name, I want to nurture new life for others who suffer as she did." It was a sobering speech, devoid of the arrogance that once defined him. When he finished, there was a brief applause. Tears glistened in Mary's eyes. Dr. Montague inclined his head in quiet approval. That evening, after everyone left, Richard lingered in the greenhouse. He placed a single white orchid, Isabella's favorite, in a pot near the walkway. The overhead lights bathed the blooms in a gentle glow, reflecting off the glass walls. He stood there in silent reflection, the journal tucked under his arm, letting the night air fill his lungs. Finally, he spoke to the empty space, his voice hushed but determined. "I can't change the past," he said, tears forming. "But I promise you, Isabella, I'll do better. I'm sorry it took losing you to see the truth." He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of orchids, hoping that somewhere, in some intangible realm, she might hear him. In that quiet sanctuary of living blossoms, Richard Blackwood vowed to live out the rest of his days, honoring the woman he had loved too late and lost forever. Richard Blackwood's tragic journey reminds us all that love can be a fragile, precious thing nurtured by care, yet destroyed by neglect and cruelty. In the end, no amount of wealth or power could undo the wrongs he inflicted upon Isabella. But with Isabella's guiding spirit, he found a glimmer of redemption by dedicating his resources to helping others in her memory. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it with friends and family. Let the tale of Richard and Isabella's heartbreak serve as a reminder that love demands compassion and honesty, not control. Like this video if you believe in second chances, share it to spread the cautionary wisdom of their story, and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, thought-provoking tales. By engaging with this story, we keep Isabella's legacy of hope alive and remind ourselves to cherish the love we have before it's too late.